Hey, Coastal. Welcome to another edition of our midweek Q&A. I have Brooke Coyne with us, who's our worship director. And tonight, in a moment, her and Jeremiah are going to share a song. What is it called again?
Another in the Fire.
Another in the Fire. And it refers to Daniel chapter 3, obviously, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So I want to kind of ask Brooke a little bit of the meaning behind this song and maybe how you've experienced this in your own life.
Sure. So if it's okay, I will share a testimony. So in 2009, I was 19, and I was traveling over that summer with a traveling worship team called Pneuma. It was based out of then Valley Forge Christian College, now University of Valley Forge. And we would just, the goal was to travel up and down the East Coast and minister to students and at youth camp and churches and all that. And so we would, drive all summer long, stay at people's homes, do all of that, do the camps, be camp leaders. So it was quite a lot of work. It was a lot of work. So we had gathered on campus in May of 2009, and we started our week-long rehearsals. We would rehearse for 8 hours a day, practicing our music. Wow. Yeah, it was serious. But that day I woke up and my heart was racing, just very randomly and erratically, and I didn't know what was going on, but I was like, well, maybe tomorrow will be better. So the next day I woke up, went to rehearsal, and again it started to race. And I was like, this is weird. But it would just race for hours, like 3, 4, 5 hours sometimes, like long periods of time. So I didn't know what to make of that. So anyway, fast forward, we get on the road, we start doing these, camps and stuff, and every day my heart would race in some shape, way, or form.
So what did you think was going on then?
Well, at that point I started to get concerned. I actually called my cardiologist back home and set up an appointment with them. But that was after I had an episode that put me in the ER. My heart had been racing for something like 16 hours.
Wow.
Ended up in the Carlisle ER. Jeremiah, my husband, drove out to come see me. He was my boyfriend at the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, we ended up in the Carlisle ER, and they had to do, I don't even know the technical term for it, but I just call it a heart flash, is where they stop and restart your heart. It was horrible. It felt like I was dying for half a second. But anyway, that's how they had to, make it stop. And then the team and I decided it was best for me just to take a week or two off and go home and meet my cardiologist and see what's going on. So in that period of time, we realized I had, again, layman's terms, a loose circuit is what I like to call it, but basically a nerve ending in my heart was firing and randomly causing my heart to race. So the long-term solution was a surgery scheduled for the day after Thanksgiving that year. The short-term solution was to put me on a medicine, a beta blocker. So I got on that, which you take every day, and it seemed to be doing okay up until, I got back into tour. So we find ourselves in this camp in New York, and at that point, I realize head to toe, I'm covered in softball-sized bullseye rashes. I had no idea where they came from. Yeah. Put me in a New York ER. Turns out I'm allergic to beta blockers.
Oh, wow.
Had to be pulled off of those. Had to get a skin biopsy to confirm that, which was not my favorite thing either. And meanwhile, through this whole entire, this is we're 2.5 months into this tour. And, going into it, I really was going into it with a good heart, with good intentions. I was like, Lord, this is my summer. I want to give it to you. I want to minister to these students at these camps and these churches and just kind of, do some ministry. And I didn't understand why, with me going into it with that mindset and that heart to please God, I was being afflicted. Why am I going through this? And
because you would think, if I could interrupt for a second, you would think, I'm serving the Lord. I gave up my summer for Him.
Right.
Everything should be great.
Right.
God should bless that. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I was really wrestling with that concept, and I had people praying for me all over the place. And so I knew I was being covered in prayer, but still not
But bad things were happening.
Yeah, bad things were happening. They were getting worse. They weren't getting better. So anyway, I had been wrestling with that. And the last week of our summer tour, we ended up in a New Hampshire camp. I think it was New Hampshire, somewhere all the way up top.
Yeah.
And, when I got there, I was just like, Lord, this is the last week. God, if there's anything you have for me, please reveal it to me. And interestingly enough, the speaker that they had lined up for that evening, when he saw me, he looked at my my team leader, and he was like, that girl has a heart condition, doesn't she?
Get out of here.
No, I'm not making that up at all.
Wow.
And she was like, yeah. And he's like, I think God's going to heal her by the end of this week.
Huh.
And I was like, okay, we've only been praying for how long? We'll see,
Yeah, right.
So anyway, in the middle of that week, they had this big prayer service and all the youth there. I mean, there were several hundred kids there. They all got around me and laid their hands on me to the best of their ability and prayed over me. And, there came this breaking point. I think it was a Thursday night where I was like, Lord, I do not know why I'm struggling with all these heart problems. I don't know what your plan is in the middle of this, but even if you don't heal me, I'll choose to serve you regardless.
Wow.
And the next morning I woke up, met my team. We packed up our trailer. We loaded up our stuff. We started to drive away. And my heart didn't race. And it didn't race the next day or the next day or the next day, to the point where I got several weeks into this and I called my cardiologist and I was like, hey, I think the Lord may have healed me. I don't think we need to go through with surgery. And he was actually a Christian, and I didn't know that whole time. And he was like, that's awesome. I believe it. And I'm happy for you. So I was able to cancel the surgery.
Yeah.
So in all of this, I kind of learned that, I had it in my mind that if I'm serving the Lord, if I'm doing what he wants, then nothing bad should ever happen to me.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I realized in the midst of what was going on that that's not true at all.
Right.
And the Lord was showing me that sometimes he puts us directly in the fire to refine us, to shape us and kind of mold us, make us into mature believers. That way I can be used later for his glory.
But you didn't realize this when this was going on. You were questioning God, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of the normal thing that we do.
Yeah.
So the next time something like that would occur to you, you learned your lesson?
I hope so.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about this song that you and Jeremiah are going to share.
So we're going to sing Another in the Fire by Hillsong. And we connect so much with this song, but especially my favorite line, you'll have to listen for it, is the ending thought, where we say, I count it joy come every battle because I know that's where you'll be. Because sometimes we forget when we're in the middle of the storm, we're just so worried about us, that we forget that God promises that no matter what we walk through in our life, he will always be with us. And there's joy in that. So
it's beautiful. All right, let's take a listen.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. When I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. All my dead left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning, either way I won't bow to the things of this world. I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding what power set me free, there is a grave that holds nobody, and now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Whoa, and I can see the light in the darkness. As the darkness bows to him, I can hear the roar in the heavens. As the space between we're standing, I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me, I'll count it joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. And I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to him. And I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between we're sitting. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. Another in the fire standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me, I'll count it joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I'll count it joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I count it joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I count it joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be.
Hey church, good evening. Glad to join back with you here on our midweek study of the book of Daniel. This is called One True God, and tonight we're looking at chapter 3, which is one of the chapters that everybody kind of waits for. This is the fiery furnace, the story of throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace. Before we jump into that, though, I want to kind of just talk with you, because there is a great, just a step that we're learning in biblical study here. And here's what I mean by that. Whenever you're looking at the scriptures, there's a difference between a text meaning versus a text application. Each verse, each passage, each paragraph in the Bible, it can only have one meaning. It can only mean what the original author intended it to mean. But it may have a multiplicity of applications. When we first jumped into this course, we were originally thinking, when we called it One True God, that we would look at this. This is Daniel writing, and Daniel wants to communicate what it means to carry the testimony of one true God into a culture that has many gods or is just incredibly apathetic towards all things religious. And we said, well, that's certainly our culture today. But since we started the course, everything's changed, hasn't it? And now all of our focus is on this disaster, this pandemic, this calamity that we're going through. And we look back at the text and we go, it doesn't change the meaning of the text, but it certainly changes, or at least it kind of reorients how we're looking at our application. And that's perfectly appropriate when it comes to studying the Bible. You can go back to a text multiple times and the text doesn't change its meaning, but you may get something different as you return back to it. And that's because things in your life may require a different application of that text. And that's kind of where we are here. So what I would say is this, is that now that we're in this course, we're still on the notion of what does it mean to have a testimony of the one true God. But rather than going, hey, we want to learn about that in the light of a culture that's apathetic towards God, we're now looking at it in the light of a culture that's experiencing a disaster. And that's not us changing the text in any way, shape, or form. The ancients, they knew about disasters. The very word comes to us from an incredibly old origin. If we were to pull it from the Latin, it's a combination of two words. Aster, which means star, from which we get astronomy, astrology, and all the other root words that go along with that. But aster means star, and dis, which would mean against, or in our case, out of alignment. The word disaster is the combination of those two words. Dis and aster, the ancients would talk about times like this, and in their minds they would say, the stars are out of alignment. Everything's going wrong. And that's kind of where we are. We're in this place of just everything just seems to be in complete upheaval. So what does it mean to carry the witness of one true God in the face of disaster, in the face of calamity, in the face of everything is completely going wrong? Before we jump into the text, I'm just going to reiterate something that I feel like we have been communicating both on Sundays and then here on midweek as well. I think when we started into this, the general mentality of everybody, myself included, was, okay, this is just something we have to get through. This is a season we kind of have to go through. But now we're beginning to kind of realize that, you know what, that this could be longer than anybody realized. The ramification, the effects, this could be harder than we originally thought. I think all of us in our minds were thinking to ourselves, oh, by mid-April, late April, we'll be back to normal again. And it's not appearing that that's the case. And I'm not wishing that, I'm not hoping that, I'm just saying that that's what we're all feeling. And when we look at the text of Daniel, when we look at this tonight, again, our question has to be, Daniel is clearly writing, Daniel is the author, he is communicating, hey, he wants to write to us about what it means to carry the testimony of one true God. And we want to ask the question, well, what does that look like in the light of what we're going through, in the light of what we're dealing with, in the light of everything that's going on? So before we do that, or before we get into the main points, let me actually start by reading the text and jumping straight into chapter 3. And if you have your Bibles there, you can look along with us as well. And there's also a handout. Yes, believe it or not, we're still keeping faithful to the handouts. You can either get it from our Facebook group, which is Midweek at Coastal, or you can go to our website and you'll see the little icon there that says download the Midweek handout. And you can download that and follow along with us there as well. Daniel chapter 3 says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. And we'll look at this in just a second, but that's 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. And he set it up on the plain of Dur in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So I don't know about you, but the question that I have reading this is, how did we get here? I mean, think about the end of chapter 2. Think about how much Nebuchadnezzar just seems to be completely overjoyed that God gave Daniel the interpretation to his dream. And here he is setting up a statue or an image to himself. And we said last week that sometimes when people have overzealous or just have a great zeal for God, that it could be genuine, or it could just mean that they got what they needed in the moment and then it fades away. And that's the case of what took place here. But more than just that, we know from archaeological evidence, from historical studies, we kind of have a feel of what was taking place in chapter 3, and I'm going to describe this in just a moment. But what was happening was that here's a king who has risen to power prematurely. He's young, and there is constant rebellions against his authority. And we know that in December of 595 through January of 594 BC, that there was a coup attempt, coordinated coup attempt on his life to remove him from power. And he is overreacting again, because we saw previously in chapter 2 how much the king is ready to put people to death who can't give him the answer. And now what he's going to do on the backside of this failed coup is he is going to show how much support and strength there is for his leadership. And so he erects this statue. He builds this massive statue. And there's two things that he's wanting to do here. Contrary, if you've ever read the story before, a lot of people sometimes incorrectly assume that Nebuchadnezzar is setting up worship to one of his gods. And that's actually not what's taking place. This is all about political positioning. This is all about him consolidating all of the power and showing visibly how much he's in control and how much support there is to him. This is a pledge of allegiance of sort, where he's going to invite governors, military rulers, mayors, college professors, anybody of influence. He's forcing them to come out, and he's going to visibly show exactly what's taking place, that he is in control and that he alone is the one who can rule this kingdom. And like I said a second ago, this is not just from chapter 3, this is not just from biblical commentaries. We have historical and archaeological evidence that points to this. One of the most fascinating things in all of archaeological support of the scriptures is that we have Babylonian tablets that have been pulled out through archaeological digs. We actually have what at the time were called clay prisms as opposed to clay tablets, because they were circular in nature, in which they would inscribe the writings of the kings on it. We have one that is in a museum in Istanbul, which is known to be a clay tablet, a clay prism, with Nebuchadnezzar's own writings on that. And what's so fascinating about this clay prism is that experts agree that they believe that on this very prism are the actual names of Daniel's friends. We believe that we can translate the Babylonian writing and we find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's names and their titles. Because remember, at the end of chapter 2, Daniel had asked that they be put in essentially governor-style positions. This clay prism has their names on it. And more than just their names, get this, because this is just fascinating. More than just their names, we believe that this very event is recorded on this clay tablet. One of the translations that's pulled off of the tablet reads this way from the Babylonian writing, and this is Nebuchadnezzar's own writings. This is what he decreed and was inscribed on this clay prism. These are the words on the tablet. It says, I ordered the following court officials in exercises of their duties to take up position in my suite. And then it lists the exact same people groups, the exact same officials that we just read in chapter 3 are listed here on this clay tablet. And historical experts and historians agree that what is written here is likely the exact same event of chapter 3 that we're looking at here as well. And I go to at length to talk about all that because I don't know that we've talked about it as much in some of our Old Testament studies, but the wealth of historical and archaeological evidence that supports the events of the Scripture, that somebody could hear this story of Daniel chapter 3 and about King Nebuchadnezzar building this 90-foot statue, or maybe it was just an obelisk, some people believe, a lot like the Washington Monument. We have, outside of the Scriptures, we have the evidence that this event actually took place. We know that the coup against his life was historically accurate, and this calling of all these people to come and worship him so that he can visibly show how much control he believes he has. We know this to be historically accurate. And so the scene's set. The king is going to force this allegiance to him. We know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not just biblical people. We know from this clay tablet these are historically accurate events, and we know that they have gotten caught up in this. And we know again that the penalty is death for not obeying, and so all the anxiety that goes along with that. So what does that mean? I think that there's 3 points that, or I think that there's 3. Let me rephrase this for the benefit of biblical study. So just as a side note on biblical study, when we come out and we say things like this, 3 things I want you to see, or here's 4 points, we're not suggesting that the text is cleanly separated or segmented into 4 clean areas and that there's 4 points in the text. All I'm going to suggest here is that I think there's 3 key things I want to relay here in this kind of a study about what it means to have a witness for one true God in times of disaster. The reality is I think that there's probably 10, 11, or 12 key things that we should look at. But in the interest of a video like this, trying to keep it semi-brief, so I say, look here's 3 core elements that we should look at together in the text. When it comes to our witness for one true God during times of hardship and disaster, I think there's 3 core elements that I would have us look at. Here's the first one. I think that sometimes our witness for God may require that God removes things we've depended on. Let me say that again. In order for our witness to be effective about the reality of one true God, it may require that God removes the things that we have depended on. Think about this for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because there's 3 things that have been removed from them. Here's the first one. Because this is a story from Daniel 1 all the way through to the end of the book, we're following this story as it progresses forward. Think back to Daniel chapter 1. Verse 3, it said that then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Again, remember the context of what we're looking at here. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the hundreds of other individuals, the youth that were in the conquer of Israel, in the conquer of Judah, these were exiled and pulled into Babylon. They are no longer at home. They are no longer with their parents, if their parents were even left alive during the original raid into Judah and into the southern territories and into Israel. They have lost their parents. They have lost their home. They have lost all things familiar around them. That whereas there was a period of their younger life where they were surrounded by the Hebrew and the Israelite culture and all things of Judaism, all of the things that would have given rise to their identity as people of God, all of that has been removed from them. The second thing that's been removed from them is their church and their way of worship. What do I mean by that? Look back at verse 1 of chapter 3. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dur in the province of Babylon. Now, to translate that into measurements that we'd understand, that's about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. The best way to illustrate this is take a look at this statue out in Butte, Montana. This is a statue called Our Lady of the Rockies. This is a 90-foot high statue. It's certainly wider than 9 feet, but I think this will give you a great visual representation of how big this statue or this monument was that Nebuchadnezzar built. What's key is that it calls it an image of gold. And Daniel will use that phrase, image of gold. He calls attention to the fact that it was overlaid, maybe it was solid gold. Experts believe it was more likely built out of wood and then overlaid with gold. But the notion that it was covered in gold is called out 7 times in this chapter alone. And here's the question. Where did this gold come from? And I think that this is what we are supposed to understand because it's going to point to some of the historical significance. If we were to look at 2 Kings chapter 24, 13 to 14, verses 13 to 14 reads this way. It says, As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Israel, had destroyed the temple, and he had taken everything out of it, all of the gold articles. And even then we can go back further and say, well, what were all the gold articles in the temple? What were all the gold articles? Where did all those things come from? And we know the answer to that as well. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 11. It tells us that Solomon's father, David, it says, King David dedicated the articles that he had won in conquest. He dedicated these to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. In other words, it's this. What was previously the way of worship for these young guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what was previously their pride and joy, the temple in Jerusalem, the place of worship to God, that was what they were used to. That's what they were raised on. That's what they were comfortable with. That was the way in which they worshiped God. That's where they carried on their sacrifices. That's where they sung their songs unto the Lord. That was their familiarity. That was their comfort. That's been destroyed. And now they're standing in front of a statue that's covered in gold. And I'm not saying exclusively by the gold from the temple. Surely we know that Nebuchadnezzar had tons of conquests. But it is absolutely conceivable that the gold that was taken from the temple and from the people in Jerusalem has now been converted into this statue. Think about this. Not only have they lost their homeland, their parents, their ethnic surrounding, they have completely lost their own temple and their way of worship. That's what I mean by when I say they have lost their church. They don't have a church building anymore. They don't have their pride and joy in a structure that they used to go to. That's been removed from them completely. Now they're standing in front of the statue that's covered in the gold that would have come exactly from that area as well. And then there's one last thing that was removed from them. In addition to their church and family, in addition to their place of worship, they've lost their point man. I could almost title this that they've lost their pastor. Daniel is not in this chapter. That's the one glaring absence in all of this. Daniel was their salvation in chapter 2. It was Daniel's boldness in being willing to try to take a stab at interpreting the dream, seeking God, getting that interpretation, which allows him to set these three young men up for success going forward. But now in chapter 3, he doesn't exist. Or I say he doesn't exist. He's just not in the chapter. Even though he's the one writing the story, he's leaving himself out. What we believe historically is that by virtue of the dream interpretation of chapter 2, the king, it tells us in chapter 2, pulled Daniel into his royal court, and that the king's royal court would not have been subject to this decree to bow down. That would have been a sign of the king's paranoia if he believed that there were rebels even that close to the throne. So he would not have forced his royal court into this edict. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by giving them these governor positions of governorship, they are included. And so now Daniel is not in a place to help them. There's nothing that Daniel can do. If Daniel steps up and begins to speak from this point, the king will simply think that Daniel's in allegiance and trying to hide something. So there's no mention of Daniel stepping in, speaking up, defending them. These guys are on their own. They have lost their support in their point man. They have lost their support of the person who in chapters 1 and 2 was the primary person going to the Lord for them, was the primary person interceding for them. But now Daniel's not there. So again, think about this. They are in a place where they now have to stand on their own. They can't lay claim to God through their ancestry because they're no longer in their homeland. They can no longer say, well, we are Hebrews in Jerusalem, because they're not there anymore. They can't lay claim to God through their church. They can't say, well, yeah, I'm a Christian because I go to that church, because that building doesn't exist. And they can't lay claim to God through their, and I said to make this kind of a connection, they can't lay claim to God through their pastor, because Daniel is not in a position to intercede for them at this point. Daniel certainly was praying for them in all likelihood, but he was not in a position to step forward and do something for them. The point being this: they're on their own. And here's what's amazing. That is a good thing. In the midst of disaster, in the midst of hard times, God likely helps us grow our witness for Him by removing things that previously we thought were good, but we were dependent on them way too much. I want you to think back to a first day for you. Here's what I mean by that. Maybe when you were a teenager, you were helping out at a local convenience store, and there came the day that the owner of the store gave you the keys and said, today, you're in charge. And the owner left. And remember that, if you can remember that, maybe that first day that you were without support, it was you, and you were the one completely in charge. Maybe you're a hairdresser and you can remember the very first time that you ever by yourself without somebody else helping, actually handled somebody else's hair thinking, if I mess this up, this person's going to be so incredibly upset with me. Maybe you're a doctor and you can remember the first time you ever had to handle a patient completely on your own without somebody else over you giving you the guidance. All of these kinds of firsts we can remember. I remember the very first day on the beach patrol in June of 1989. It was 1990. You join the beach patrol, and there are weeks of academy and training. And at least when I was on the patrol, they actually had 2 weeks at the front of your guarding where you had to sit with another veteran guard, where you didn't actually have your own tower. You would sit with this person, and that person was the one in charge. You were just there to have the guidance. But I can still, as clear as day, the first stand south of the pier down at the inlet, South Inlet, I can still remember with crystal clarity the complete just lump in my throat and fear the very first day I sat in that tower, and there was none of the support that I had previously. These kinds of first, it requires the removal of structures that we were too dependent on if we're going to in any way, shape, or form grow. God does that for us at times. There are seasons where God removes the things we were previously way too dependent on. And I don't want this to come across as negative or judgmental, but there are times that we as Christians get way too dependent on our church. We get way too dependent on our pastor. Everything about our witness, everything about our life, our testimony for God in the culture is all about, I go to that church, or you should meet my pastor, or, whatever the case is, or I'm a Christian because I grew up Christian. We might rely on our own upbringing. We might rely on our church. We might rely on our pastor. And God finds fit to sometimes remove those things as a way to get us to stand on our own 2 feet and just be the witness for the one true God that we need to be. And this is a time that we're there. We can't come to our building. We are all remotely separated, so there is no, hey, you should go meet my pastor, or you should go talk to my pastor. This is a time where each of us just needs to stand up for the Lord because those other things have been removed. Here's the second thing I think that we see about our witness for one true God in times of disaster. It's that our witness is supposed to be centered around the fact that God is able, not that God will do something. Say that again. Our witness of the one true God needs to be around the fact that He is able, not that He necessarily will do something. The background of this story is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are now in a place where they're supposed to bow to this statue, this 90-foot monument, and they don't. And what we read is that there's individuals who are jealous of all the praise and the support that the king gave them back in chapter 2. And so they call out to the king. They make it known to the king that of the thousands upon thousands that have been called back here to worship this monument, that there's these 3 guys that aren't exactly falling in line. Look at the text with me. Verse 13 says, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, hey, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I've set up? Now, listen, when you hear the sounds of the instruments playing, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, well then great. But if you don't, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And incidentally, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're not under any assumption that this is an idle threat. Not just because they know how vicious Nebuchadnezzar can be, but they would have also known from their own writings that they had in their hands. Jeremiah, the prophet that preceded them, actually writes in chapter 29, specifically prophesying and speaking for the Lord, that there were prophets who Nebuchadnezzar had thrown into the fire that even Jeremiah was aware of. This was not some idle threat. This was something that they knew was very, very, very real. And I want you to see what their response is. Daniel chapter 3, verse 16, it says, these 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve, and listen to this word, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And He will. If He chooses, He's able, and if He chooses us to, then you better believe we can be delivered from the Majesty's hands. But, and here's what's so key in verse 18, notice their words. It says, but even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Listen to those words, because it is a thread that goes throughout the entirety of Scripture. They say He's able, but even if He doesn't, we will still worship. We do not worship God because He's going to do something. There is some language in the church that's been around for years. It's not new, but it's still present today. That you'll lots of times hear people say that they're laying claim to something and that God's going to do something. And there's this notion that, well, if we just act confidently enough, it'll come through. But the reality is that we don't know the mind of God. That is something that is specific to Him because He's God. He may do something. He may not. Our worship is not built on God answering every single one of our prayers the way we want it answered. Our worship is to be built on the fact that we know He's able, but if He doesn't, He's still worthy of our worship. I said that this is all throughout Scripture. I mean, look at 2 Samuel chapter 15. This is one of my favorite stories, and it has fueled decisions I've made in life. It has fueled my own personal walk with the Lord so many times. David has had to flee Jerusalem because his own son has rebelled against him. David was the anointed king, not Absalom. And David's leaving the city, and a couple of the priests who are not happy with the political, essentially, upheaval, secretly go in and steal the Ark of the Covenant, and they take it out to David. They meet him secretly out on a side road where David is leaving the city and no one knows the path that he's taken but these two priests. And they meet with him and they bring him the ark and they say to him, hey, David, the ark belongs with you. You're God's anointed. The ark belongs here with you. And notice how David responds to them. He says in verse 25 to the two priests, he says, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, He will bring me back and let me see it and His dwelling place again. But if He says, I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let Him do to me whatever seems good to Him. And this is why David was called a man after God's own heart. He understood what it meant to worship the one true God. There's only one true God. It's Him. It's not even us. And David says, the ark belongs with God's people, not with me. David says, I don't know what He's going to do. He may actually be upset. This may be a period of discipline for me. This may be a period of growth for me. I don't know what's in God's mind at the moment. But I'm not going to presume anything. So take the ark back. We will wait and see, and let's see what God does. Regardless of what He does, though, David says, I'm good with it. I think that has to be kind of our attitude, our maturing during this season that we're going through here. That we have to say, we don't know what the timeline is, what the deadlines are. We don't know if God's going to repeal the virus or not. But it doesn't matter. We know that our God's able, and that should be sufficient for our witness that He is, in fact, still the one true God throughout all of this. There's so many places, and I don't have to stay in the Old Testament. Think about the New Testament. Thomas, who is affectionately known as Doubting Thomas because of that one moment in the upper room after Christ's resurrection where he wanted to see the marks on Jesus' hand. He was actually one of the boldest disciples that Jesus had. When Jesus proclaims that He needs to go back into Jerusalem, that he needs to go back into the city. The concern among the majority of the disciples is, look, the last time we were there, they tried to stone us. We could die if we go there. And notice in John chapter 11, verse 16, it says that Thomas said this to the rest of the disciples. He doesn't even say this to Jesus. He says to the rest of the disciples, well, then let's go. And we'll die with Him. Thomas goes, it doesn't matter if Jesus gets us through this. I mean, they've seen Jesus calm the waters, stop the waves, still storms. They've seen Jesus feed thousands. But Thomas in this moment doesn't suggest that Jesus is going to pull out some kind of supernatural trick out of his magic bag. He just goes, we're going to go with Him. And if we die, we die. But we follow Him regardless. That's Jesus' own prayer. We'll focus on this in a week here. As we go into Holy Week and start thinking about the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus' own approach in the garden towards his Father is, I would that you would take this cup, but it's not my will. It's yours. Our witness during this period of time, during this hardship, has to be based around the notion that our God is able. Not that he will, because we don't know. If he does, nobody would want that more than all of us would want it. But it's focused, and this is what Daniel's portraying here, and it's what these three men, their testimony is. King, our God's able. And if he chooses to, you better believe he'll deliver us from your hand. But even if he doesn't, we're going to stay true to our worship of him. And that needs to be our heart as well. Here's the third and final one. Our witness at times is strongest in the fire, not outside of it. Our witness at times is strongest by God taking us through the hardship, not by God delivering us out of it. Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 to 30, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his armies to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, still wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire actually killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, guys, wasn't it 3 men that we just tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly. And he said, well, how come I see 4 men walking around the fire unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods? For us to understand or maybe get some visual cues, you can see here that from archaeological evidence what some of these brick kilns look for. And that's what these furnaces were used for. We know that in Babylon that they were they had incredibly efficient brick-making skills. And so a lot of these massive kilns were used to get fires hot enough and large enough to be able to bake and then ultimately to dry out tons of bricks at any one point in time. And they would have had an opening at the top to vent air out, that they would operate a lot like chimeneas do, the kind that we buy and put on our patio, is that you put the fire inside and that way the airflow can be pulled in to the opening and then the heat in the air can rise out through the top. And so the soldiers would have taken the men to the top of this and they would have thrown the men in, and at the moment of throwing them in, the heat from the furnace that was coming up killed the soldiers themselves. But the king and everybody else that's standing around has the ability of looking in the main opening and is able to see the men as they fall in, stand up, and now there's 4 of them. Let me finish reading the text. Verse 26 says, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. It says that those guys came out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the royal advisors crowded around them. To pause there for a moment before I finish the text, I want you to think about how God is orchestrating this, because there is so much power in this verse. The reason that it lists all of those officials again is because think about how the story started. These are the people that God has called to come and stand around Nebuchadnezzar's image. The original opening of the story is that Nebuchadnezzar erects this image, this statue to him, and he calls all these people to come and surround that image and worship that image. But God has turned the story completely on its head through these 3 young guys. By their willingness to stay true in their witness to the one true God, they get thrown into the furnace. And now look at how the poetical nature of the Hebrew writing, all of these same people that were there to get around Nebuchadnezzar's statue are now standing around God's display of power. They're standing around the brick kiln, and they see who the real one is that has the power. They saw that the fire, continuing in the passage, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship a god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of these men will be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Apparently, this is the only thing Nebuchadnezzar knows how to do, is consistently say, I'm going to destroy you unless you obey what I say. And then it says, conveniently, which is almost kind of a little bit of a comedic mockery, I think, from Daniel's writing. It says at the end of chapter 3, and then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Incidentally, they were promoted back at the end of chapter 2, so who cares? I feel like there's almost sarcasm in Daniel's putting that in to show, okay, so they've gotten promoted again. That's not the point of the story. It's not that they got benefits from the king on this. The story is about the testimony and the witness to the one true God. But here's what I want to point you to here at the end. I want you to notice God did not rescue them here in chapter 3 the way he did in chapter 2. God did not have Daniel show up. God did not have Daniel or their pastor show up and defend them. God did not have somebody intercede for them. They ended up having to go through this ordeal. They had to be bound with ropes. They had to be walked to the top of that furnace, and they were thrown in. But that's exactly where God's witness was going to be the strongest. This is the place where God was going to display his power and completely make that 90-foot statue a complete mockery. For God, it was going to be a brick kiln where these three guys, and they would see the evidence of this forth, and just for the purpose of the text, so it doesn't look like I've avoided it, there's all kinds of debates. Was it Jesus? Was it an angel? I know that the King James says that it was the Son of Man, but that honestly is a translation where the translators, unfortunately, are writing into the text what they theologically want it to be. Nebuchadnezzar would not have had any knowledge about that title, Son of Man. He would not have had any knowledge about who Jesus was, or that Yahweh would proclaim the Son in the prophecies of the New Testament yet. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know who the fourth is. He just simply said it was appearance as if a son of God's. And the only reason he says son is because it looked like a human being, and that's how he, in his Babylonian mindset, would have translated it. It could have been an angel. It could have been an archangel, Michael, Gabriel. It could have been Christ. It absolutely could have been Jesus himself. But the text wants us to center on this notion that their witness was in that fire. It was not being rescued out of it. It was not being delivered through clever talking, through any kind of a clever defense. It was the testimony had to be in the furnace. You see, here's the application. There are times, in fact, as hard as this is sometimes for us to grasp, there are times that our witness for God is strongest in the trial, not out of it. And so God does take his believers through rough patches and intends for them to weather the storm. And this is why the second point was so important. Why I said that our witness for the Lord has to be about the fact that he's able, not that he will. Because sometimes God doesn't deliver us. He's able to deliver us, but sometimes God doesn't because he has a stronger story, a stronger testimony he wants to bear out through our lives in the midst of it. We could be there right now. I don't know. But in the midst of all of this disaster, in the midst of all this calamity, in the midst of what's coming down the pipe, there could be hardships that we're facing here into the future that we don't even know about. And God may, in fact, say, my people are going to go through this as well. But his testimony in that could be something that he can only display to our culture during these times if we will allow him to take us through the storm and give our witness and testimony to who he is during that. We have to grasp that. If God delivers us early, if God makes this all blow away next week, great. But there may be something larger here that God's doing that we want to be able to grasp. I don't think that we always understand this point to its fullness. Think about Psalm 23 for just a moment as I bring this to a close. Psalm 23, the famous 23rd Psalm, realize that it says this. In verse 4, one of I think the most famous parts of the 23rd Psalm says, even though I walk through the valley of the deepest darkness, or what most of us know as the valley of the shadow of death, please understand that the psalmist understood in this writing that we go through the valley. The psalmist does not write, well, even though he takes me around the valley, or even though he delivers me away from the valley. The psalmist writes, even though I walk through it. I love the New English translation here. The Net Bible says, even when I must walk through this valley. But what's the answer that the psalmist gives us? He says, I will fear nothing, for you are with me. That language, God will be with us. That is our promise in the Scriptures. That concept of God being with us, it presumes that there's going to be hardship. But the Scriptures give us so much confidence in this. Isaiah 43 reads this way, now this is what the Lord says, the one who created you, O Jacob, and formed you, O Israel. Don't be afraid, for I will protect you. I will call you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I am with you. When you pass through the streams, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not harm you. And incidentally, let's not forget Jesus' words to his disciples and ultimately to us in Matthew 28:20. He says, remember, I am with you always to the very end of the age. You see, God's promise that he will be with us, that is what we hinge on. When it comes to hardships, when it comes to hard times, what Daniel wants us to understand is that our testimony of the one true God, that may come with certain things attached to it. It may mean that God has to first remove the things that we're dependent on. It may mean that we have to think more about the notion, not just think, but we need to really understand that our worship of God is because he's able, not necessarily because he will do something. And then ultimately, there are times that God's witness is stronger, if not strongest, in the fire as opposed to outside of it. Whatever the case is, whatever tomorrow holds, whatever the next week holds, whatever the rest of 2020 holds, the encouragement that we get from Daniel who's lived this, and ultimately Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because the story focuses on them. What we walk away from the text with is to say, God, it doesn't matter what tomorrow holds. It doesn't matter what's going to come further, whether this gets worse, whatever happens. Lord, we want our witness to our outside community to be that there is one true God. He is able, and he is the one to ultimately be worshiped. This text is such an incredibly, incredibly powerful text. Here's my encouragement to you in closing. Go back this week. Go back this week and read this chapter again. Find time alone, privately, where you're sitting down, and whether you just have a cup of coffee or you're just quietly looking at it. Read through this text again, thinking about these points, and let the Lord encourage you that he's with us, but that he will use our witness to his glory if we'll just let him. God bless you, church. I look forward to talking to you next week.